In this video, we're going to be talking about the book of Revelation and different interpretations of the book of Revelation. I just started speaking at a church in Cornish, New Hampshire. I mentioned that in another video. I'm doing pulpit supply there, and I decided to speak from the book of Revelation and talk about Jesus's messages to the seven churches. So I am speaking from the book of Revelation right now, but I'm focusing on just the first few chapters, and I'm not planning necessarily to get into all of the later chapters where you get into all of that heavy imagery, the apocalyptic imagery later in the book of Revelation. However, I am studying some different commentaries. This is one of the commentaries I was looking at. And as I was thinking about all this, lo and behold, another pastor and fellow YouTuber, Pastor Matthew Everhard, has a video that he just put out talking about the book of Revelation, and that he is going to be doing a study on the book of Revelation at his church. I think he's going to be going through the entire book. And so he did this introductory video on his channel called Revelation Preview, Foundations, and Presuppositions. And I found it to be a really interesting video, interesting to hear his perspective, and I encourage you to check out his video. I've had Pastor Matthew Everhard on my channel before where he talked about a book that he wrote. He's a wonderful author, a great pastor. He's Presbyterian, and he has a particular view of Revelation that is different than mine. So I will talk about that, but I wanted to mention something that he talks about in his video, and that is the different schools of interpretation of Revelation. And so if you watch his video, he spells this out some, but I wanted to show you here from the ESV Study Bible, which is a fantastic study Bible. I highly encourage people to get the ESV Study Bible for this very reason. It just really spells things out in a very clear way and presents different views on things like this. So here you have the schools of interpretation of Revelation. It says 4 approaches for interpreting Revelation have been distinguished by their understanding of the relationship of the visions to one another and the relationship of the visions to the events of history. So the first school of interpretation is Historicism. Historicism understands the literary order of the visions, especially in 4:1 through 26, to symbolize the chronological order of successive historical events that span the entire era from the apostolic church to the return of Christ and the new heaven and earth. So as I go through these, be thinking about which one you hold to. I'd love to hear in the comments which school of interpretation you lean toward. It'd be interesting to hear different perspectives. The historicist view, though, views Revelation largely as being about the history of the church, as you see here in the chart that they provide. And so chapters 4 through 19 are compared to the different eras of the church, the history of the church. So that's the historicist school. The second school is the school of futurism. Futurism likewise treats the order of the visions as reflecting the order of particular historical events, with some exceptions. Futurists, however, typically view the visions of chapters 4 through 22 as representing events still future to 21st century readers. And so that's the real key point here about futurism, is it sees what is talked about later in Revelation from chapters 4 on as being future, not only for the first century readers, but even for us today. And so they have a couple of futurist interpretations here. One is historic premillennialism, and you can see chapters 4 through 19 do talk about the tribulation, but when you get into dispensational premillennialism, you have chapters 4 through 19 talking about the tribulation. However, you do here have the church being raptured before the tribulation in this chart. And the idea here would be that God is actually using this tribulation to fulfill all of the prophecies concerning the people of Israel. So there's a distinction here in dispensationalism between the church and Israel. So that's the futurist school of interpretation. and a couple of different takes on that. And then the third one presented here is called Preterism. Preterism thinks that the fulfillment of most of Revelation's visions already occurred in the distant past, during the early years of the Christian church. So the idea here is that Revelation is actually talking about things that, from our standpoint, already happened in the early church. And so John was really writing for his day. So you can see here as an example that chapters 4 through 11, in their view, is talking about Jerusalem's fall. Now, as I understand it, if you're going to take this position, then you would have to believe that John wrote the book of Revelation before the fall of Jerusalem, whereas a lot of scholars, a lot of interpreters would say that John actually wrote the book of Revelation later in the first century. And now I'm sure that there are people even watching this video who have maybe a preterist position but wouldn't plot it out exactly like this. But this is an example of how some preterists or partial preterists would look at the book of Revelation. And then the fourth view given here is idealism. Idealism agrees with historicism that Revelation's visions symbolize the conflict between Christ and his church on the one hand, and Satan and his evil conspirators on the other, from the apostolic age to Christ's second coming. Yet idealist interpreters believe that the presence of recapitulation means that the vision's literary order need not reflect the temporal order of particular historical events. So I think the idea here is that idealists would view a lot of Revelation as talking about the battle of good and evil throughout church history, but that it's not necessarily in chronological order. So it's like the historicist view in that it reflects church history on some level, but the historicist view would say that Revelation is showing the chronology of church history, whereas the idealist school is more saying that Revelation is showing the overarching spiritual realities of church history and what is happening in the battle between good and evil. At least that's my best understanding of what's being presented here. Now, Pastor Matthew Everhard does say that this is the school of interpretation he falls into. So if you watch his videos, I'm sure you're going to really get a better understanding of this approach to interpreting Revelation. And I'm going to probably watch some of those videos at least. I'd be interested to hear his perspective, because this is not actually a school that I have been very familiar with myself, hearing interpreters from that position. And then at the end here it says, finally, some interpreters hold a mixed view, combining features of these various positions, such as saying that many events have both present and future fulfillments, or saying that many events have past fulfillments, but that there may still be a future personal Antichrist. And so, yes, you're going to read some people in certain commentaries, for example, where they will actually give a mixed view of these different schools of interpretation. And I think even to some degree, I probably have some of a mixture of different views. However, when all is said and done, the view that characterizes my position the best would be the Futurist position. And I come from a dispensational background, so I lean in that direction, but I do believe a lot of Revelation is talking about future events, even from our perspective. What I would say, though, is it says here that this view looks at it as a distant future from the standpoint of John and the churches of Asia. One thing that I would put as a caveat there is that I don't think John, the writer of the book of Revelation, and the first hearers knew how long it was going to take before Jesus returned. None of us do. And so, while yes, from our perspective, we realize it was the distant future, from their perspective, they understood it as this could happen at any time. Jesus could return at any time. And that is my position. I think we still don't know how distant into the future some of these prophecies are going to be fulfilled, but some of them do still have a future fulfillment that we await. Let me just give you a few passages, though, that to me are a compelling reason for having a more futurist approach to Revelation. Now, this isn't the whole of my position, but I think it shows you the kind of thing that influences me. So the first passage is Matthew 19:27 and 28. Peter said in reply, "See, we have left everything and followed you. What then will we have?" Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you, in the new world, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." And I'm looking at this passage thinking, how did Peter and the apostles hear this? And I believe that when they heard Jesus talking about judging the 12 tribes of Israel, they believed that he meant that literally. That their understanding is that one day they would be judging the actual tribes of Israel, the people of Israel. Now, Acts chapter 1, verse 6 and 7 kind of backs us up even more, where Jesus, after he rose, is with his disciples, and when they had come together, they asked him, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" Clearly, they were expecting a kingdom for the people of Israel. How does Jesus respond? He said to them, "It is not for you to know the times or seasons that the Father has fixed by his own authority." Now, some people may look at Jesus' statement as hinting that their understanding is wrong. Personally, though, I don't see that in here. I think that's an argument from silence. Jesus doesn't correct them there in any way. I don't even think he's hinting that they're wrong. He just says it's not for you to know the times or seasons that the Father has fixed by his own authority. Now, I suppose that some people might argue that, well, the apostles still didn't have a full understanding that Jesus would eventually impart to them through the Holy Spirit. And so some people do think that Israel no longer really has a place in God's plan. But then when you go to the book of Romans and you hear what the Apostle Paul says, I think you say even after the resurrection and the coming of the Holy Spirit, they still expected something for Israel. So Paul says in Romans chapter 11, verse 13, "Now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, and as much then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump, and if the root is holy, so are the branches." And he says a little later here, "Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel." So who is Israel here? It's clear from the next phrase, "until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in." So you have here a distinction between the Jews and the Gentiles. And Paul is actually giving an eschatological prediction here, prophecy here about what will happen with Israel. He says a partial hardening has come until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. And then he points to Old Testament prophecy. The deliverer will come from Zion, he will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. And that's from the book of Jeremiah. So Paul here is actually using the Old Testament in a very literal way. He's talking here about this is a promise for Israel, that God will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And so he's applying that to the ethnic people of Israel in contrast here to the Gentiles. So when I look at these things, I just don't see how you can see it any other way than God still has a plan for Israel. And in light of that, I really do believe that this points to a framework that I see prophecy through, and I think we can make a good case for it, that when you look at prophecy, there is a strong case to be made that God has a plan for Israel, and therefore, as you look at what the scripture does here, you can see there is a precedent for taking prophecy in a literal way. Now, when it comes to apocalyptic literature, like the book of Revelation, I understand that there are people who would say, well, Revelation is very symbolic, and so you shouldn't take it in a highly literal way. And I do think there's a continuum here where you can be overly literal. I've seen, for example, in the Left Behind movie where they have the two witnesses of Revelation actually breathing out fire from their mouths. But you also have in the book of Revelation Jesus depicted as a sword coming from his mouth, and I don't think that's meant to be taken literally. So I don't think the two witnesses have to be presented as actually having fire coming out of their mouths. I do think you can be overly literal. However, I think a real key to understanding how to interpret apocalyptic literature would be a book like the Book of Daniel. And what you see in the Book of Daniel is that on one hand, there are strong images, very graphic images of beasts and things that are clearly in that realm of apocalyptic literature, and yet they are pointing to earthly realities in a very clear way. And Daniel actually spells some of that out in the Book of Daniel, and you can see how it applies to earthly kingdoms. So being literal in your approach to a book like Daniel or Revelation doesn't mean that you have to look at the beasts as actually being beasts that are coming onto the earth, and that we're like looking for these giant beasts to come in the future. What it does mean, though, is that those beasts represent earthly realities. And you see that in the Book of Daniel, where they represent different kingdoms, and I believe the Book of Revelation does the same thing. So I think it can be a mischaracterization when people say, why do you take the Book of Revelation literally? That they think literally means you think every picture in the Book of Revelation is actually going to come true in a literal sense. And that is not really the futurist perspective. What it is more is we take Revelation in the manner that we take other prophecy. And so that's why I showed you some of those passages, to show that I do think there is a case to be made for God's future plan for Israel, and also for us to take prophecy at face value when you have Jesus taking prophecy at face value, the apostles taking prophecy at face value, and not overly spiritualizing it. So that's kind of my short case for how I approach the Book of Revelation. I'm sure there's a lot of people who disagree. Maybe some of you totally agree with me. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments to add to this discussion. It'd be so interesting, fascinating to me to hear different perspectives, where my audience is coming from. Matthew Everhard, by the way, did take a poll on Twitter asking which best describes your view of Revelation. And you see here that actually my view, the Futurist, is in one of the minority groups, whereas a lot of people fall into the Preterist and Idealist groups, at least from Matthew Everhard's audience. So I know there are a lot of different views out there. And in one sense, it's all the various views that keep us from sometimes wanting to talk about this book of the Bible and our views on the end times. But I actually think having different perspectives is a good opportunity for us to talk to each other about how we interpret the Bible, how we understand things. And that's what I wanted to do in this video. Also point you to Matthew Everhard's channel to tell you about his study of the book of Revelation. I know that's going to be really interesting. So thank you so much for taking a look at this topic with me from A Frisch Perspective.